The train carrying 200 German prisoners of war had been traveling for 3 days when it finally crossed the border from the United States into Canada in the late summer of 1943, moving the men further from the European war than most had ever imagined they would go. The prisoners were mostly Afrika Korps veterans who had been captured during the final fighting in Tunisia, supplemented by some Luftwaffe personnel and a handful of U-boat crewmen whose submarines had been sunk in the Battle of the Atlantic. They had spent weeks in temporary detention facilities in North Africa before being shipped across the Atlantic to the United States, then transferred north to Canada, where POW camps had been established to house the overflow of German prisoners that American facilities couldn't accommodate. And the journey had been disorienting and exhausting, moving the men through landscapes and climates completely unlike anything they had experienced, taking them further from home and from any realistic hope of escape with each mile traveled. The prisoners had developed certain expectations about what captivity in North America would be like, expectations shaped partly by Nazi propaganda about the supposed brutality of democratic powers and partly by their own experiences of war and military culture. They expected harsh treatment, minimal rations, forced labor under dangerous conditions, the kind of captivity that reflected the total war mentality that had characterized the conflict in Europe and North Africa. Some feared worse: summary execution, torture, a deliberate starvation, though most recognized these fears as products of propaganda rather than likely reality. What none of them expected, what their entire frame of reference gave them no basis to anticipate, was that Canadian captivity would challenge their fundamental assumptions about what war meant and about the societies they had been fighting. The train pulled into a small station in rural Ontario, surrounded by endless forests and farmland that stretched to horizons unbroken by the destruction that had become normal in Europe. The prisoners were unloaded and formed into columns for the march to the camp that would be their home for the war's duration. And it was during this march through a small Canadian town between the station and the camp that the German POWs encountered something that would fundamentally confuse their understanding of the war and of their enemy. The town was completely intact, not just undamaged by recent fighting, which they might have expected so far from any combat zone, but showing no signs whatsoever that its population was engaged in a war for survival. Shops were open and appeared to have goods for sale. Houses were well maintained with gardens that suggested peacetime normalcy. Children played in yards. People went about daily business with an ordinariness that seemed impossible for a nation supposedly fighting total war. What shocked the German prisoners most profoundly, what several would later describe as the moment when their understanding of the war began to change, was watching Canadian children playing freely in front yards while German POWs marched past under armed guard. The children weren't frightened or hostile. They were simply curious, some waving at the passing column of prisoners with the innocent friendliness of children who didn't understand that these were enemy soldiers. Parents stood on porches watching the march with expressions that showed interest but not fear or hatred. The town seemed utterly untouched by war, its population going about normal peacetime activities despite being at war with Germany for nearly 4 years. The contrast with Germany, where years of bombing and total mobilization had eliminated any distinction between military and civilian life, where children grew up knowing air raid sirens and rationing and fathers who never came home, yet was so profound that many prisoners struggled to process what they were seeing. The POW camp itself reinforced this cognitive dissonance. It was newly constructed, purpose-built for housing prisoners, with wooden barracks that were simple but weatherproof and adequately heated. The prisoners were issued clothing appropriate for Canadian weather, were provided with rations that, while not luxurious, were adequate and regular in ways that German civilian populations hadn't experienced in years. Medical care was available. Mail service allowed communication with families in Germany, however delayed and censored. Work details were organized for prisoners fit enough to work, but the work was agricultural labor on Canadian farms rather than dangerous war industry that would have violated Geneva Convention protections. The camp's commandant addressed the new arrivals through interpreters, explaining rules and expectations in a matter-of-fact tone that suggested routine administration rather than punishment or revenge. Over the following days and weeks, as the German prisoners adjusted to captivity in Canada, many found themselves grappling with implications that their initial observations had raised. If Canada was at war with Germany, yet its cities were undamaged, its population living normally, its children playing safely, then what did that say about the war's nature and about Germany's strategic situation? The prisoners had been told that Britain and its empire were fighting desperately, barely surviving under the weight of German military pressure, their population suffering and their resources exhausted. Yet here was Canada, part of that empire, are showing every sign of a prosperous society that could afford to devote resources to housing and feeding enemy prisoners comfortably while still maintaining normal civilian life at home. The psychological impact of this discovery varied among the prisoners. Some maintained that what they were seeing must be exceptional, that surely other parts of Canada or Britain must show more evidence of war's impact, that this particular town and camp couldn't represent the Allies' general condition. These prisoners clung to the narrative they had been taught about Allied desperation and imminent collapse, unable to reconcile the evidence before them with their ideological commitments. Others began questioning everything they had been told about the war, and recognizing that if Nazi propaganda had lied about Allied conditions, then it might have lied about other things as well. These prisoners started asking guards and camp administrators questions about the war's progress, about conditions in Britain and the United States, about whether German propaganda's claims bore any relationship to reality. The Canadian guards and camp staff, initially uncertain how to handle prisoners' obvious confusion about what they were observing, gradually recognized that simple honesty about Canadian conditions served everyone's interests better than attempting to hide or minimize the contrast with Germany. Guards explained that yes, Canada had been at war since 1939, that yes, Canadian forces were fighting in Europe and would eventually participate in invading Germany, but that no, Canada itself had not been bombed or invaded, that Canadian civilian life continued with modifications for war production, but without the desperate total mobilization that characterized Germany. Some guards took satisfaction in explaining this to prisoners, seeing it as evidence of Allied strength. Others felt uncomfortable rubbing prisoners' faces in the disparity, recognizing that it must be painful to realize one's homeland was being destroyed while enemy nations lived in comfort. The contrast became even more stark when prisoners began working on Canadian farms and interacting with Canadian civilians who employed them. The prisoners saw firsthand that Canadian farms produced abundant food, that shortages existed but were nothing like the starvation conditions developing in Germany, or that the Canadian population was well-fed and adequately supplied despite shipping massive quantities of food and material to Britain and to Allied forces. German prisoners working alongside Canadian farmers couldn't help but notice that the farmers' sons were away fighting, that Canadian families had made genuine sacrifices for the war effort, yet that those sacrifices hadn't prevented continued prosperity that made German conditions seem apocalyptic by comparison. Some prisoners found this realization liberating in strange ways. If Germany was losing so badly that its enemies could fight while living normally, then Germany's defeat was certain and continued resistance was pointless. Or this recognition made captivity easier to accept. They weren't temporary prisoners who might soon be freed by German victory, but rather men who would remain in Canadian camps until Germany's inevitable defeat, at which point they could return to whatever remained of their homeland. For these prisoners, adjusting to long-term captivity and making the best of Canadian camp life became the rational response to their situation. They learned English, participated in camp educational programs, took interest in the work they were assigned, generally treated captivity as an extended but temporary interruption of normal life, rather than as ongoing combat by other means. Other prisoners found the disparity between Canadian prosperity and German suffering deeply embittering. Yet they felt betrayed by leadership that had led Germany into a war it couldn't win, that had told them lies about enemy weakness while sending them to fight opponents whose resources and strategic position were overwhelmingly superior. These prisoners' anger was directed not at their Canadian captors, who were treating them correctly, but at the Nazi regime that had created the conditions making this captivity necessary. Some became openly critical of Hitler and Nazi ideology in ways that would have been dangerous in Germany, using the relative freedom of Canadian camps to express doubts and criticisms they had suppressed during military service. Camp authorities monitored these discussions carefully, recognizing that disillusioned prisoners were both potential sources of intelligence and potential problems if their disillusionment turned into active resistance against camp administration. The unexpected thing that German POWs saw when they reached Canada wasn't a single dramatic revelation, but rather a gradually accumulating recognition that the war they thought they were fighting, a desperate struggle between equally desperate opponents, was actually something quite different. They were fighting from a position of profound strategic disadvantage against opponents who could absorb losses and continue fighting while maintaining civilian prosperity that Germany couldn't match even in peacetime. This recognition didn't make captivity pleasant or eliminate prisoners' desire to eventually return home, but it did fundamentally change how they understood their circumstances and their futures. The Canadian authorities managing POW camps gradually recognized that prisoners' exposure to Canadian prosperity served useful purposes beyond simple detention. It demonstrated Allied strength in ways that propaganda couldn't. It reduced prisoners' will to resist or escape since the war's outcome was increasingly obvious, and it potentially created attitudes among prisoners that might make them more amenable to democratic governance when they eventually returned to Germany. Whether this exposure to Canadian conditions actually influenced prisoners' post-war political attitudes remained debatable, but camp administrators believed it was having positive effects on prisoner behavior and cooperation. For the Canadian civilians who interacted with German POWs, farmers who employed them, townspeople who saw them working or marching through communities, guards who supervised them daily, the prisoners' obvious shock at Canadian conditions provided a kind of vindication of the Allied cause. If Germany's soldiers were this surprised by ordinary Canadian prosperity, then clearly the Nazi narrative about fighting against desperate enemies had been propaganda. This realization reinforced Canadian confidence in eventual victory and in the justice of their participation in the war, making the sacrifices Canadian families were making seem worthwhile when placed against the alternative of what German prisoners described as conditions in their homeland.